Hello everyone, I'm Sasuke, and I really love to read. And this is the story of how my deep adoration for RF Kuang led me to become an opium expert. If you don't know who RF Kuang is, she's a Chinese American novelist who has written about a variety of different topics from the geopolitical climate of 20th century China to the fun bits about the publishing world. She's walking such an interesting path. She's an academic and she's also publishing fiction work. In this video, I wanted to talk about how I prepped myself for reading the popular trilogy by R.F. Kuang rather than the actual experience reading the trilogy itself. When I first found about R.F. Kuang, I knew that her work was really important and meaningful to her, and I wanted to honor it properly during reading. For some reason, the popular trilogy was the first of her works to catch my eye, and I knew I wanted to start my R.F. Kuang journey by reading the popular series first. I read the blurbs of the books, I found out what it was about, and I immediately stopped in my tracks because it was a topic that I knew nothing about, that I had not studied about in school. And immediately that put me in a position of wanting to educate myself about it before getting into it. So I read two books before getting into the popular trilogy in order to really in order to improve my reading experience and understand the book better. And I think you should read these books as well. So number one, I read The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. Iris Chang is also mentioned in the dedication section of the first Poppy War book. So The Rape of Nanking is a non-fiction book which describes the real historical events that occurred at the time of the Second World War when the Japanese forces invaded China with the intent of colonization. The language of the book itself is pretty easy to read. It's a narrative journalistic style, if you will. Content of the book, however, is very dark and gruesome. I would recommend you check out the trigger warnings before reading it. The Rape of Nanking was such an important book to read because it shed light on a topic, on historical events that I had not read about before, which I feel like are really important, especially for understanding modern day China and their policies. So I learned a lot from this book. I could also understand why R.F. Kuang, as a Chinese American writer, would want to center her story around those events and bring attention to them. The second book that I read was The Sea of Poppies by Amitav Ghosh. Sea of Poppies is a book that I haven't really seen any of R.F. Kuang's readers talk about because it sort of tackles the subject of opium trade from a different angle. So, Sea of Poppies essentially is centered around the British colonization of the Indian subcontinent and how white men forced Indian peasants to grow poppy crops so that they could be traded illegally across the world so that white men could earn money. It's all about money. The book really details the exploitative labor and the economic slavery that the British employed on Indian people. So in this book we sort of see the journey of the opium trade through human lenses. So the story starts with a widow who has to leave her village and try to forge a new life for herself in a culture which doesn't allow widows to have much social mobility. On her journey, the main character meets other people who also in very different ways are attached to the opium trade. So main character is actually a poppy farmer. She does a lot of backbreaking work in order to farm poppies that she sells to the British factories. For that, she gets back really little value, barely enough money to survive. And then some other characters that she meets across the way. One is a Chinese guy who became an opium addict due to the unrestricted opium trade happening in China at the time. And then there's an Indian Raja who loses all of his property, again because of colonialism and some bad decisions that he made, etc., etc. So even though the story is centered around the Indian subcontinent and the British India, it still gives us a lens on how the opium trade affected Chinese people. So I read these two books. So that was The Sea of Poppies by Mita Wash. These are the two books that I read before getting into before I picked up the Poppy War trilogy by RF Kuang. I feel like reading these two books gave me the knowledge and perspective going into the trilogy and helped me understand and RF Kuang's voice better. So the Poppy War series is actually classified as a fantasy series. So it has a lot of magical elements in it. However, it's really hard to ignore the historical aspect of it. Course of the plot across the series is based on real historical events. And I feel like understanding the history behind it is so important to truly understand the meaning of this series. If you're someone who really wants to get into RF Kong, I would recommend you start reading the Poppy War series. It is dark, it's going to break your heart, but again, please check the trigger warnings for it. This series will give you a great opportunity to learn history, even the current geopolitical climate as well, with regards to a lot of things happening. Um, Through RF Kong, I'm learning about a lot of new things, and I'm really grateful for that. I had a lot of fun reading the Poppy War trilogy. Um, and this was all the work that I did so I could give myself an enjoyable experience. And now I'm an opium expert. Sasuke signing out.